Okay, so I now want to talk a little bit then and get more specific about the different kind of ideas, theoretical models, by which I really just mean sort of ways of thinking we've developed to try to explain how cultures and land are connected. On some level, we've always had a sense of that, right? There's a type of thinking that we sometimes call environmental determinism, and it's a fancy word, but what it really just means is this idea that pops up in human society over and over and over again. As people encounter different people, we sometimes get this idea in our head that, oh, that group of people act that way because of the land that they're around. So that's something we've seen people write about almost for as long as there's been writing. For example, early Chinese writers that had traveled around the empire saying, oh, such and such group is very wild because they live right by these like wild rivers, right? So that's a very sort of crude environmental determinism. You live by a wild river and therefore your personality or your culture is very wild and tempestuous. During the time of the ancient Greeks, the whole idea of like the different humors that went into our body chemistry, but that different places had different kinds of humors, different that were more or less prevalent, or different kinds of sort of vapors and airs that affected your internal humors, and therefore would have affected your health, if not your psychology, potentially as well. And so the idea that environment shapes how we act, certainly not a new idea, something people have been bringing up almost as long as there's been writing and people traveling and noting other people are different than them. It's a reoccurring theme. It's one that got very popular among social scientists in the 1800s and 1900s, as social sciences were sort of just coming into their own and trying to discover the laws of human behavior, right? Trying to figure out, hey, how can we scientifically explain why culture A is different than culture B? The theory that some people ended up landing on is like, oh, it's environment, right? And sometimes this led into kind of scientifically racist ideas, such as like, oh, people of the cold Nordic countries are more like stoic as a result, right? So sometimes this starts to like sound kind of like justifications for racial stereotypes. Um, Other times it was a little more sophisticated than that. So for example, we have here an example from an early book that's relating the amount of sort of solar energy that areas receive with kind of like major civilization areas, which is sort of interesting and kind of bizarre as well. Now, obviously, environmental determinism is like most things that we call determinisms, we call them that because they're simplistic, and we recognize nowadays that it's not a very good theory, right? We can think of all sorts of counter exceptions, right? It's obvious that just because a group of people live in a place with the wild river, it doesn't make them wild, or that people that live in a cold environment are necessarily more stoic than anybody else. And it's worth pointing out that two cultures can live basically next door to each other, very similar climate, and have really different cultures. The Navajo and the Hopi, where I used to do my fieldwork, really, really good example. Very different religion, very different way of organizing sort of, either really concentrated villages for the Hopi, for the Navajo, these really spread out kind of farming settlements based around families. Really different cultures, even though they're like right next door to each other in what we now think of as Arizona. So environmental determinism is simplistic to the point of being wrong, right? It just doesn't quite work. But although it doesn't quite work, there's a reason I think that it keeps coming back to people, right? I like to say sometimes that even if you think you hate anthropology theory, we all do anthropology theory, right? We all try to figure out why other humans are the way they are, which is really all that theory is. And there's a reason why people sort of often go back to, oh, it's because of that crazy environment they live in. There's something appealing about the idea that land somehow shapes culture. So even if it doesn't, even it's not this environmental determinism where we can say these simple, crazy stereotypes like, oh, people that live in the north are gonna be more stoic, right? Even if we can recognize that as oversimplistic, stereotypical nonsense, the fact that we keep thinking that way suggests that implicitly we recognize that there's some connection here. So we're going to explore some of the ways in which cultures and lands are connected, and specifically some of the different theories that have been used to describe that connection. And a lot of these theories have overlap. I'm going to talk about 7 of them. They have a lot of overlap, but they also each kind of emphasize a different thing. So we'll start with what's called the cultural ecology approach. If you take my culture and ecology course, we do a deep dive into this. Partly because some of you have taken that course and partly because that's not what this course is, I'm not going to do as deep of a dive into here, but I want you to understand that in the early 20th century, a lot of anthropologists were not paying attention to environment at all. They were really just looking at cultures in and of themselves, right? The culture developed in this way because the culture developed in this way, or because they came into contact with this other culture next door. But there was a group of people kind of starting in the 30s, 40s that pushed for this idea of cultural ecology, most notably a guy by the name of Julian Stewart, and then a lot of people who came after him. But basically this idea of, environment, it's got a big effect, right? We don't want to do environmental determinism. We don't want to say that environment shapes everything, because that's clearly not the case. People have free will. People come up with their own cultural ideas. Cultures are unique. Nonetheless, land does determine some things, right? There's a reason why teepees, for example, proliferated across the Great Plains of the United States, as did nomadic bison hunting, as did tribal organizations that could link up for certain kinds of activities, including large bison runs, and then break apart as needs be, right? There's a reason that several of these plains groups, such as the Cheyenne, such as the Comanche, such as the Lakota, Dakota, and Nakota, had very similar cultures and do have similar cultures, and that's because they were adapting to a very similar land that was forcing them well, not forcing them into, but sort of shaping them into this sort of nomadic bison hunting that then affected a lot of other things. Teepees are a really great way of having a home if you've got a bunch of bison skin laying around to make the teepee, and if you need to be able to move at a moment's notice. They're not a great adaptation to the Arctic tundra, right? So environment clearly shapes some things, and that's what cultural ecology says. And the way it was originally formulated by Julian Stewart is he said that there's a culture core, right? He said, we've got our environment, and then we've got the technology people use to adapt to that environment. So in the case of plains cultures, right, specific kinds of bows, arrows, horse riding tech, things like that. When the environment and the technology people are working with get married together, you have a sort of subsistence system. You have a way that people make a living on that land. How they make a living based on their environment and their technology, right? How they make a living reverberates out into other things. It's a core that has effects other places, right? Suddenly you have to have a religion that's not built around some sort of like temples and like formal priesthood, but instead can do more of these like collective ceremonies that happen every once in a while when people are in the same area, like Sundance, as well as a lot of individual spiritual activities like Humbla Kaya or calling for a vision or vision quest. So his argument would be, how we adapt to the environment reverberates out into other things. It doesn't determine everything, right? But it does certainly shape some things. Or as I put it here, a salmon ain't a trout, but they all got gills, which grammatically is not a great sentence, but gets the point across. 3 cultures in the same area are not going to look exactly the same. And that's why Julian Stewart sometimes called that multilineal evolution, right? It's not just one trajectory. If you're living in the same environment, you might go this way, you might go this way, but there's going to be sort of some broad guardrails that you're going to tend to go in a few different directions in a specific environment. Now, if you have a different kind of technology, like suddenly you have farming technology that involves mechanized irrigation, suddenly maybe you're going in a different pathway, which was part of Julian Stewart's point, right? That it's not like environment 100% shapes things, partly because humans can develop new technologies that shape how we can adapt. But nonetheless, it is going to kind of send you down to certain trajectories over others. He developed that theory, by the way, in working with Ute and Paiute people in kind of what we now think of as Nevada, Utah, California. He interviewed a lot of elders about what their lives looked like before the early 1900s. By the time he was doing his fieldwork, by and large, people had become part of villages/towns that were in one place, and they were shifting over to an agriculture way of life, partly due to heavy pressure from outsiders, and essentially confinement to reservations and things like that. But prior to that, back in the 1800s and 1700s, and as long as anyone could remember, Ute and Paiute people were, I don't always like the word nomadic because it implies that people don't have a territory, and there's not a people that either doesn't have a territory or didn't at some point have a territory or have some sort of bounded area. So nomadic's not a great word, but I'm going to use it here. Ute and Paiute people had this sort of nomadic thing going on where they would go around to different parts of the land, huge stretches of Utah, Nevada, etc. They would go to different parts of the land depending on what was in bloom, what was going on right then. If there was an abundance of rabbits in one area, a whole lot of small families, it would glom into a big old kind of like tribal group and make use of the rabbit run and get a bunch of meat. On the other hand, if it was the part of the year where there's a lot of nuts that are coming into, I don't know if ripeness is the right word, but anyways, a lot of edible nuts across the landscape that are coming into the stage of their life cycle where they're very edible and good to eat. It makes sense for the people to break away from being in a tribe formation into their small family groups and then each go kind of a different direction because you never quite know where the nuts are going to be. And so it makes sense to kind of everybody go a different direction and hope, in theory, we're all hopefully going to find some stuff, or at least some of us will. And it doesn't make sense to try to just stay in one place when you don't know where the resource is going to show up any given year. So his point with this, he argued it very well with lots and lots of good data. Take note, future anthropologists, he did great research. He didn't just rely on platitudes, but he actually did actual data. And he basically showed that Ute and Paiute culture was heavily based on what the resources were doing at a given part of the year. When they were spread out and patchy, so was the social group. When they were unified in certain areas, so was the social group, right? So the environment and the fact that people had hunter-gatherer technology to use that environment shaped what their overall society looked like and gave them sort of a social arrangement of fluidity between large tribes and small family groups. Fascinating stuff, really good stuff. High five to Julian Stewart. So cultural ecology is an interesting kind of line of theory. And you saw that a little bit in the Thornton reading. I liked his example of canoes. He talked about that in Icy Bay area of Alaska, which is more towards the north part of Tlingit territory, and indeed into Eyak territory, right? I think it's right there on the edge. You have these gudiye, which are these canoes that were small, but they had this really heavy thing on the front, as well as this protuberance that allowed you to kind of cut through sea ice that you're coming into contact, but to do so very quietly and to push it aside so that you can get through really icy waters quietly to then sneak up on animals that you're hunting. By contrast, 100 miles south in Glacier Bay, where the Hunat Tlingit people lived and live, people had a very different kind of canoe. The concern there was not getting through sea ice quietly because there was a lot less sea ice. There's sea ice, but most of the ice is up in the glaciers and stuff in that area. Instead, the concern there, and it's not so much even the temperature as it is kind of the geography of it. It's like a bigger bay. And so there's less of a concern of sort of these ice choked areas where you have to worry about your boat making too much noise against the ice. But what is a concern now that you've got a larger bay, so larger lines of sight, is animals seeing you and fleeing. So people have glacier white clothing, as well as like blankets, essentially like covers that you would put over your canoe that would allow you to basically blend in with the ice. I showed this picture to Charlene, my wife, and she's like, holy crap, like that's awesome, right? The like clothes like match the color of the glacier. It's like perfectly, right? Like you blend in. It's really cool. And so it helps you to sneak up on the animals more easily. So two very different types of canoes, even among the same culture, basically, depending on what kind of bay you're living in. So really cool stuff. All right, so I'm going to be kind of going through these different ideas rapid fire. So here's the next one. In addition to cultural ecology, a couple decades later, you saw the rise of what sometimes nowadays gets called the ecosystem approach to culture. And it was developed by anthropologists variety of different anthropologists, but the most well-known, at least among anthropologists, is a guy by the name of Roy Rappaport. He did a famous study called Pigs for the Ancestors, famous in the sense that, more than 10 people have read it. Anyways, and one of the things he showed, and I also do a deep dive in this in my culture and ecology class, but here I'll just give you kind of a preview. He found with a New Guinean group of people he worked with, the Tsembarag, he found that they had a way of staying sustainable in their ecosystem as small-scale pig farmers, that basically when the pigs would start to get at a level where they were starting to be a nuisance to the human population, right, breaking into gardens and things, and presumably eventually that would also be a nuisance for the land itself, they would hold a ceremony where they slaughtered the pigs and began a period of war. During the period of war, people would benefit from the fact that they just ate a lot of pigs, so they'd have increased protein for the warfare they were doing. And this is kind of small-scale tribal warfare, not like aggressive, going to last for 30 years kind of warfare. But anyways, there would be a period of war, and once that calmed down, people would plant essentially peace trees, like rumbin plants that symbolized that the war was over. And then they would start a time period where they then grew their pig populations up until they became too much again and start the cycle over again. If you look at that, and if you're at all familiar with how ecosystems work, you're realizing that what we have here is like what we sometimes call a negative feedback loop, which doesn't mean bad, but what that means is that it's a balanced feedback loop, that when something gets to be too much, there's then a negative pressure to bring it back down, as opposed to a positive feedback loop where something becomes runaway. Here you've got, when something gets too big, you've got a negative pressure to drive it back down, a balanced system. And so Roy Rappaport was, writing in the 60s and 70s and 80s, and he was obviously paying attention to what people in the 50s were starting to write about. In the 50s, 40s and 50s, you had biologists, ecologists, who were coming up with this idea of ecosystems, like, hey, these animals are not just some like random array of animals on the land, but it's some kind of a system where there's pieces, puzzle pieces that fit together, and there's interactions, and the wolves keep the population of elk down, and then the elk affect the willow population, and it's like a system, a puzzle. Now, nowadays, we actually recognize that ecosystems are a lot messier than that, and although there is feedback loops and stuff, there's also a certain degree of mishmash, hodgepodgeness going on with ecosystems. But at the time, people were very much viewing it as these like tightly interwoven, perfectly balanced systems. And Roy Rappaport and other people like him were like, oh, what if humans are part of those systems? Maybe not modern industrialized Western economies that are like destroying the planet with pollution back in the 60s, but what if small-scale people are like that, right? People that are small-scale farmers that have been in the same forest for 800 years, 1,000 years, 2,000 years. If they've lived in that area sustainably for so long, it stands to reason that somehow they're a population of physical beings, just like a population of pigs is a population of physical beings, just like a population of trees is a bunch of physical beings. They have nutrients, they need energy, they somehow need to be balanced in with the overall ecosystem. So this idea that we could apply ecosystems to cultures and think of cultures as one part of a much bigger ecosystem, that they were as much controlled and required to be in balance with the system as any other wildlife species. Now, an interesting corollary of that, if you take it all the way to its logical extreme, is that not only do human beings have to find a way to fit into the ecosystem puzzle, but maybe even that we are an essential part of that puzzle, that just like wolves are necessary for the Yellowstone ecosystem to act the way it does, because otherwise the moose populations get out of control and mess up the willows, which messes up the rivers. In a similar vein, perhaps humans are like that. Perhaps we actually have roles in ecosystems that if you removed us, suddenly the ecosystem maybe doesn't collapse, but looks a lot differently than we're used to it looking like, right? And there's some evidence for that in different societies. So anyways, it's an interesting kind of theory, this idea of the ecosystem approach to culture. And we can certainly see what happens when that doesn't work well, right? So sometimes Roy Rappaport and his followers were right that sometimes small-scale and pre-industrial cultures fit in really well, one more piece of the puzzle of an ecosystem. but at other times a group was fitting in well and then can collapse, right? We sometimes talk about maladaptation, right? The acknowledgement that as well balanced as some groups are with their ecosystem, others, for whatever reason, their culture gets out of whack with it. And that can sometimes lead to what we think of as collapse. Now, a collapse is kind of in the eye of the beholder because, for example, the Mayan collapse that I'll talk about now, it's not like Mayan people stopped existing. It's just that their cities went from being huge mega cities that were making huge stone temples and then distributing out into small farming villages spread around the whole landscape, right? It was a decentralization. It was people shifting away from the monarchies and just kind of doing their own thing. If you're Joe Farmer, maybe that doesn't feel like a collapse. Maybe that feels like a sweet, I finally got the monarch off my back, and bonus, I don't have to go up to the temple to do randomly large ceremonies every once in a while. But we call it a collapse in the sense that the culture was becoming much, much more larger and a unified empire, and then it broke apart into small units. So you have this time period, 300 to 800 BC, or CE or AD, we think of as sort of classic Mayan urban civilization. They were doing a lot of stuff before that, but this is sort of the flourishing that we often think of with the major cities and the temple architecture and everything. And then all of a sudden, around 800 CE, boom, the cities are abandoned, which is why when the Spaniards show up, you have all these gigantic, like mega temples and stuff like that. And also a bunch of native people, but the native people aren't living in the cities, right? These cities are almost like ghost towns, these like ancient Mayan cities. Instead, they're living off in like villages and other places that they've set up in the middle of the lowland jungles. Like, why? And we've wondered that for decades. And there's different answers to that, but sorry. There's different answers to that have been proposed, but kind of a dominant theory now for what happened to the Maya is this: that the Mayan sort of empire, classic Mayan empire, had environmental issues like a drought that happened, but then they also had social issues, and that the social issues made the environmental issues get worse. So, for example, the elites did what elites do and kept trying to extract more and more wealth from the people. As a result, people had to put more and more pressure on their own individual farms to funnel their produce, which was their wealth, to the center of the empire, right? Classic kind of empire behavior, get the little guy to send you their taxes. But to do that, the little guy had to, among other things, go from sustainable slash and burn, where you leave land alone for decades and then come back to it, to suddenly now they're having to do the slash and burn cycle a lot more quickly, right? Slash a piece of forest and come back to it in a couple of years, or maybe not even ever leave a piece of land alone and just keep farming it over and over again. If you're in a tropical, Central American tropical forest, that's a terrible way to do it, right? There's a reason that over millennia, people keep doing slash and burn the classic way of giving it, 10 years, 20 years in between farming, because when you try to farm the same plot of land over and over again in a rainforest, what's going to happen, among other things, is that your nutrients are going to leach out really, really fast, and that there's going to be tons of erosion. So basically, the fact that the elites were putting so much pressure for taxes on the little guys meant that the little guys started using the land unsustainably. I mean, they knew it was unsustainable, right? People had knowledge of that. What are you going to do when, Joe political lord comes around asking for some extra maize, right? What are you going to do? So there was that. There was also the fact that people just started to want to opt out of, wanted to use other trade networks that didn't go through the cities, right? Kind of opting out, which is, sometimes what we see today too, right? Stuff starts to get too expensive to ship into Alaska. Well, fine, I'll go hunt some of my own food, or I'll go, do some small scale gardening in my own backyard. So people started to opt out of this sort of elite system. But then there was also drought at the same time, right? If it was just intensifying their farms, maybe they would have been okay. But a drought that was sweeping through Central America at the same time as people started over farming to make the elites happy collapsed the system. As a result, a bunch of the farms ended up becoming essentially grasslands, right? Because you wrecked the normal forest recycling. The soil loses most of its phosphorus, which you need to make plants grow. A bunch of the soil washes away through erosion. You're kind of screwed. So you leave these highland areas where classic Mayan civilization was, and then go to these lowland areas that haven't been messed up and basically abandon the cities. So this is a good example of how sort of applying that idea of Roy Rappaport and that idea of, we're part of ecosystems, right? And when we don't fit in with the ecosystem, well, we collapse. I've kind of chosen to summarize that as check yourself before you wreck yourself, which is obviously an Ice Cube reference, though some of you may know it instead from Zach Galifianakis in The Hangover. Another way I've chosen to express this idea is you can shuffle your hand, but you can't ask for new cards, right? Human beings, for all of our human exceptionalism, for all of our thinking that we're different than other animals, we're still physical beings that need a certain amount of calories and materials to survive. So although we could shuffle things around and come up with creative ways of using an environment, ultimately there are still constraints of an environment that we can either adapt to or collapse. And of course, you might say, well, that's not true nowadays, right? We're not stuck in one tiny forest or one chunk of, Central America or something. And you're right to a degree, except for all we've really done at this point is start shuffling some of our cards with the players next to us, right? Sometimes by force, sometimes voluntarily. But there's still a certain amount of cards in the overall deck. We're just sort of passing them around the table more. It may prolong the inevitable, but it's not as if we've magically made there be thousands of cards where there weren't cards. There still are hard caps to how much we can grow. Technology helps a lot. There's something called the Green Revolution where we just skyrocketed how productive our farming was in the mid-20th century, which is one of the reasons we avoided mass starvations that had been predicted. Nonetheless, there are still limits to how much any given ecosystem can produce. And at some point, we have to extract the resources from somewhere, right? So we may be drawing cards from somebody else's hand, but there's still only so many cards running around. So that's the basic idea of ecosystem approaches to culture. I'd now like to talk about one final theoretical concept, and that's the concept of political ecology. So cultural ecology and ecosystem approach are both very interested in the way that environment shapes culture by culture having to shape itself to environment. Political ecology came about kind of in the 70s as a theoretical body of work that started saying, like, yeah, sure, cultures have to adapt to their environment, but this isn't some sort of even playing field, right? There's wealth and power inequalities. There's governments, there's corporation, there's powerful elites, right? The Mayan example is actually a really good example of that. And as a result, when there's these inequalities in our societies of some people having much more wealth and power than others, that often drives the environmental changes and problems that we see, right? I don't want to get overly political here, but climate change doesn't just kind of come out of a vacuum, right? There was active attempts by economically powerful organizations to deny the science of climate change for decades, so that they would do essentially what happened, which is slow the transition to electric vehicles and other kinds of technologies. And so, although I think climate is a complicated system, and I'm not trying to oversimplify it or suggest that there's ever a magic bullet that solves it, generally speaking, the acts of certain economically powerful groups and certain political lobbying groups slowed down adoptions of certain kinds of technology, which, of course, climate change would still have occurred either way, but probably accelerated it, right? So wealth and power inequalities can drive environmental change, right? Can make it go faster than it normally would have gone, or make it go slower than it would normally go. It also shapes the victims, though, which is probably the more insightful finding of political ecologists, right? We're not all equally victimized when there's environmental change, when there's collapse, right? A good example can be seen in villages across the YK area, the YK Delta, as well as the North Slope area of Alaska. There's a video on YouTube called Kivalina on the Coast, and it exemplifies this very well. I'm not going to show it to you, but I might put it in the folder. But you have a community that's on this like very narrow isthmus. Folks that are down here in Kenai Peninsula, it's almost like the Homer Spit, but it's like way up there close on the north slope. It's coastal, but the water levels are increasing as they do during a system of climate change and warming temperatures. Storms are getting more intense. People's homes are starting, the very foundation under them is starting to get washed away. And very likely eventually that community will become unlivable. And so now an isolated community with not that much capital to work with is having to figure out, okay, do we like relocate up the road? And when they do that, of course, let's say relocating 15 miles, 10 miles, that might not seem like a big deal, but A, that takes a lot of money to relocate an entire village, and B, that affects people who feel tied into the specific spot that they grew up in and that their, grandma grew up in. So my point with all that is it's not sort of billionaire CEOs, right? It's not Jeff Bezos or something that's the one whose house is going over the river, right? They've got well-protected houses somewhere that's not even close to here. And I'm not suggesting Jeff Bezos is directly responsible for climate change, just indirectly. But what I'm trying to make the point of is that the wealthy are not always, but often somewhat insulated from environmental problems, whereas it's often the poorer classes of people that get most affected by it. We also sometimes, that's related to a concept we call environmental justice, where we oftentimes see poorer groups of people, as well as certain races and ethnicities, to the extent that class and race link up. We oftentimes see poorer groups of people, more rural groups of people, as well as more inner city groups of people that tend to be more so the victims of pollution. So political ecology, one more way in which land and culture are connected. In this way, culture, specifically the power inequalities that some cultures have, shape the environment. So it's an interesting body of theory. I don't agree with every political ecology study that comes out. I think sometimes they downplay the ecology by right, and the fact that there is some degree of natural change in an ecosystem. But generally speaking, a lot of my work's kind of been in this political ecology vein, and I think it's an insightful way to look at the culture-land connection, even if I don't agree with every conclusion of it. So that's what I wanted to say about that.